I once started a war with a single sentence, and the worst part is I didn't even know the woman's name when I said it. The night began like any other night in my city, quiet on the surface, expensive underneath, the kind of place where the lights were soft, the whiskey cost more than a decent suit, and everyone pretended not to notice who really owned the room. I walked into the lounge with my men a few minutes after 9. The same corner table waiting for me like it always did, the air smelling faintly of oak, citrus, and money. People lowered their voices when I passed, not because I asked them to, but because they understood the rules of the city. My name is Dominic Russo, and whether people like it or not, this city moves when I decide it should. I wasn't looking for trouble that night, and I definitely wasn't looking for her. The bartender who had been working there for years had taken the night off, so someone new stood behind the counter, a young woman moving quickly between glasses and bottles like she had already memorized the rhythm of the place. Lily Harper, though I wouldn't learn her name until later, tied her hair back with a simple band and focused on the work in front of her like the entire room didn't exist. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone, just a black shirt, dark jeans, sleeves rolled up slightly as she polished a glass. But somehow the simplicity made her stand out even more in a room full of expensive people trying too hard. I noticed her the same way everyone else did, by accident at first, just a quick glance across the bar. Then the door opened again, and the mood in the room shifted half an inch. Victor Hale walked in with that confident smile he always wore, the kind that suggested he enjoyed standing a little too close to the edge of every situation. Victor and I had history, the quiet kind people didn't talk about out loud, but always felt in the air when we were in the same room. He spotted me immediately, of course he did, and instead of avoiding my table like a smart man might, he walked over with 2 of his associates trailing behind him. We exchanged the kind of polite greetings that sounded friendly but meant absolutely nothing. For a moment it felt like the night might pass, without anything memorable happening. Then Victor leaned against the bar, looked directly at the girl pouring a drink, and chuckled under his breath like he had just discovered something amusing. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. In fact, he made sure people around us could hear him. He nodded toward the bartender and said casually, "She's hot." A few men nearby laughed softly, the way people laugh when they think they're supposed to. The girl didn't react. She kept working, focused on measuring out a drink like the comment had nothing to do with her. Normally I would have ignored it. Comments like that happen in places like this every night. But something strange happened inside my chest before I even had time to think about it. My mouth moved first. My voice stayed calm, steady, the same tone I used when giving instructions in a boardroom. "She's mine." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. The laughter stopped immediately. Victor turned his head slowly and looked at me with one eyebrow raised, studying my face like he was waiting for the punchline. The problem was there wasn't one. I hadn't meant to say it. I hadn't even spoken to the girl. But the moment the sentence left my mouth, the entire room understood something had just changed. Victor smiled slowly, the kind of smile a rival wears when he thinks he just found the perfect way to test you. And across the bar, for the first time all night, the girl looked up and our eyes met for exactly 1 second, confusion written all over her face. That was the moment I realized something dangerous had just started, because until that second, I didn't even know her name. Victor Hale did not laugh. That was the first thing I noticed after the room went quiet. Most people would have laughed it off, made a joke, pretended the moment did not matter. Victor didn't either. He simply looked at me like a man studying a new move on a chessboard. His fingers tapped the bar once, slow and thoughtful, and then he turned his attention back to the girl behind the counter. She was still working, still pouring drinks, still pretending the tension in the air had nothing to do with her. I almost admired that. Victor tilted his head slightly and said in a calm voice that carried just enough across the room, "I did not realize the bar had become your territory too, Dominic." A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody spoke. I leaned back in my chair and lifted my glass as if the conversation meant nothing. The ice inside the drink clinked softly. "Territory has a funny way of expanding," I said. Victor smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed the game more than the result. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then he pushed away from the bar and walked 2 slow steps toward the bartender. My men straightened slightly in their chairs, but I lifted a finger and they stayed where they were. I wanted to see what he would do. Victor rested his elbow on the counter and watched the girl mix another drink. She moved with quick confidence, measuring the liquid carefully before sliding the glass across to a customer. Up close, she looked even younger than I first thought. Not naive exactly, but new to rooms like this. Victor spoke to her in a friendly tone. "Excuse me, what is your name?" She glanced up, surprised by the question, but not intimidated. "Lily," she said simply. "Lily Harper." Victor nodded like he was filing the name away somewhere useful. "Well, Lily," he said, "you make a strong old-fashioned. Maybe the best in this part of the city." She smiled politely, the way service workers do when they have heard every compliment in the book. "Thank you," she said. "What can I get you?" Victor looked at the bottles behind her as if he was deciding, but I knew he was doing something else. He was watching me through the mirror on the back wall. Finally, he said, "Pour me whatever Dominic here is drinking. If it is good enough for him, it must be good enough for me." Lily reached for another glass and began preparing the drink. For a few seconds the room returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed quietly. Music drifted through the speakers again. But the tension never disappeared completely. It sat there between Victor and me like an invisible line drawn across the floor. When Lily placed the drink in front of him, Victor lifted the glass and examined the color. Then he looked back toward my table and raised the drink slightly in my direction. "To new discoveries," he said. I did not return the gesture. Instead, I watched Lily as she wiped down the counter with a clean cloth, completely unaware that two men who controlled half the city had just started circling each other because of a sentence neither of them planned to forget. She worked with the quiet focus of someone who had no interest in power games. And somehow that made the situation even more dangerous. Because Victor finally took a sip of the drink, nodded in approval, and said something that made the entire room tense again. "You know, Dominic," he said lightly, "it would be a shame if someone else decided they liked your bartender too. I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moments in this city never arrive with shouting or chaos. They arrive quietly, wrapped inside polite conversations and half smiles." Victor Hale had just placed one of those moments on the table. His words floated through the lounge like harmless curiosity, but everyone who understood the balance of power in this city heard the real meaning behind them. "It would be a shame if someone else decided they liked your bartender too." The music continued playing from the speakers above the bar, smooth and slow, the kind of jazz that made people forget the outside world for a while. But nobody near our tables was really listening anymore. They were watching. Victor leaned casually against the counter, as if he had all the time in the world. Lily Harper wiped down a section of the bar and moved a few empty glasses to the sink. She had no idea that her name had just become a piece on someone else's board. I took another slow sip of my drink before answering. The whiskey burned slightly, warm and familiar. "People can like whatever they want," I said calmly. "That does not mean they get to keep it." Victor let out a quiet laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Interesting choice of words, Dominic," he replied. His attention shifted back to Lily again. She had started preparing another order for a couple sitting 2 stools away from him. Her movements were efficient, practiced, and focused, the way someone works when they are determined to do their job well and go home without becoming part of the drama around them. Victor studied her for a moment, then spoke again in that same friendly voice. "Lily, how long have you been working here?" She glanced up briefly. "Just a few weeks," she answered, filling in for someone who is on leave. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing the information like it mattered more than it should. "Do you like it so far?" he asked. She shrugged lightly while setting a fresh glass on the counter. "It is a job. The people are usually polite, so I cannot complain." A few nearby customers chuckled softly at that. Victor looked pleased by the answer. "You must be new to the city too then," he said. Lily shook her head. "No, I grew up about 30 miles outside the city. I just moved closer for work." 30 miles was close enough to commute, but far enough away from the center of everything that happened here. I noticed Victor smile slightly when he heard that. A woman who did not grow up inside the politics of this city. A woman who did not understand the names sitting in front of her. To someone like Victor, that made her very interesting. He lifted his drink again and took another slow sip. Then he looked directly at me across the room. "It is always refreshing to meet someone who has not chosen sides yet," he said casually. I set my glass down on the table and rested my fingers against the edge of it. Lily had already turned back to her work, unaware of the invisible lines forming around her. Victor finished the drink in his hand and placed the empty glass back on the counter. Then he stood up straight and adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "I should be going," he announced lightly. business calls. But before he left, he looked at Lily one more time and gave her a polite nod. I hope we will see each other again soon, Miss Harper. She returned the nod the way any bartender would. Have a good night, sir. Victor began walking toward the exit, but when he passed my table he slowed down just enough to speak quietly, so only I could hear him. You should be careful about claiming things you barely understand, Dominic. Sometimes curiosity spreads. Then he continued toward the door without waiting for a response. The lounge returned to its normal rhythm once he stepped outside, but something in the air had already shifted. Across the room Lily continued serving drinks like nothing had changed. But I knew Victor Hale well enough to understand one simple truth. He was not interested in the bartender because of who she was. He was interested because of what I had said. And the moment he realized that sentence had not been a joke, Lily Harper had just become the center of a game she did not even know existed. I did not follow Victor Hale out of the lounge that night. Men like us do not chase after words once they are spoken. We wait. We observe. We let the city move first. Still, I remained in my seat long after his car lights disappeared from the street outside. The music inside the lounge continued, soft and steady, like nothing unusual had happened. Glasses clinked. Conversations resumed. A couple near the window laughed about something trivial. But my attention never left the bar. Lily Harper moved from one customer to another with the same quiet focus she had all evening. She rinsed glasses, mixed drinks, wiped the counter clean in smooth circles, and occasionally pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear when it slipped free from the band. She looked completely ordinary in the middle of a room full of extraordinary problems. That was the strange part. I had seen women in places like this who wanted attention. Women who knew exactly how to draw the eyes of powerful men. Lily was not one of them. She worked like someone who believed the night would end normally, like she would clock out, walk to her car, and drive home without the world changing around her. I knew better. Across the table from me, Marco shifted slightly in his chair. He had been with me for nearly 10 years and could read the room as easily as I could. You want us to keep an eye on things? He asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched Lily slide a drink toward a customer and offer a brief polite smile before moving to the register. Victor will come back, I said finally. Marco nodded once. We both understood that was not a question. Men like Victor Hale do not walk away from curiosity, especially when pride is involved. A few minutes later, a group of businessmen approached the bar, talking too loudly about contracts and travel plans. Lily greeted them politely and began taking their orders. One of them leaned forward a little too casually, trying to keep her attention longer than necessary, asking questions about the menu that did not really require answers. She handled it the same way she handled everything else that night. Calm, professional, distant. She finished pouring their drinks and moved down the bar to the next customer without encouraging the conversation. Marco watched the exchange and then glanced back at me. She has no idea who you are, he said quietly. I almost smiled at that. Most people in this city either feared my name or respected it. Lily Harper treated me the same way she treated every other customer who walked through the door. Like another man sitting at a table with a glass in his hand. That kind of indifference was rare. I set a few bills on the table and stood up slowly. Marco and the others followed a moment later, but I raised a hand and stopped them. Wait here. I walked toward the bar alone. Lily was drying a glass when I approached, her attention still on the work in front of her. When she finally looked up, her expression carried the polite patience of someone expecting another drink order. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Up close, I noticed small details I had missed earlier. A faint line of concentration between her brows. The quiet steadiness in her eyes. The way she held herself like she was used to relying on her own judgment. What can I get you? She asked. Her voice was calm, neutral, completely unaware of the strange sentence that had tied her name to mine only an hour earlier. I considered the question for a moment before answering. The same thing I had earlier, I said. She nodded and reached for the bottle without hesitation. While she prepared the drink, I studied the room through the reflection in the mirror behind the shelves. My men were still at the table. The other customers were lost in their conversations. Everything looked normal. But I knew one simple truth about nights like this. Sometimes the smallest moment becomes the beginning of something much larger. Lily placed the finished drink in front of me and gave a short, polite nod. Here you go. I wrapped my fingers around the glass, but did not lift it yet. Instead, I looked directly at her and asked a simple question. Do you always work this late? She shrugged slightly. Most nights, she said. Why? I finally lifted the glass and took a slow sip before answering. Just wondering how long this place stays lucky. She did not react to the word lucky the way most people would. Lily simply tilted her head slightly, as if she was trying to decide whether I was joking or just another customer making strange late-night conversation. The soft lights above the bar reflected in the glass shelves behind her, turning the bottles into small golden towers. I took another slow sip of the drink while she wiped the counter in front of me. After a moment, she gave a quiet shrug. Places like this are usually lucky if people leave happy, she said. That is kind of the whole business model. Her tone was calm, practical, the voice of someone who measured life in simple results. Good service, good tips, no trouble before closing time. I studied her for a second longer. You ever feel like the room changes without anyone saying why? I asked. She paused mid-motion with the cloth in her hand and looked at me again. That depends, she said. On what? On whether you are the reason the room changed. For the first time that night, I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift slightly. She was sharper than she looked. Before I could respond, one of the businessmen down the bar lifted his empty glass and called for another round. Lily excused herself with a polite nod and moved to help them. I stayed where I was, watching the quiet rhythm of the lounge return. Chairs shifted. Music floated through the speakers again. Marco glanced over from our table, checking whether I needed anything. I gave a small shake of my head. Everything looked ordinary again, but the city had already started moving around the moment earlier. I knew Victor Hale well enough to recognize the beginning of one of his games. He would not rush. He would not confront me directly. Instead, he would start asking questions in places where my name did. Not always reach first. Who the bartender was. Where she lived. Why I had spoken the way I did. Information traveled quickly when someone like Victor was curious. Across the bar, Lily handed the businessmen their drinks and accepted their payment with a quick thank you. One of them tried to continue the conversation, asking where she had learned to mix cocktails so well. She answered politely while counting change, but after a few seconds she redirected the discussion back to their order and moved away again. Efficient, focused, not interested in anything beyond the job. That made the situation even more complicated. People who chase attention are easy to predict. People who ignore it are not. She returned to my section of the bar a minute later and rested her hands lightly on the counter. You never answered my question, she said. Which one? I asked. Why you asked about closing time. I rolled the glass slowly between my fingers, watching the ice shift inside. Sometimes the night ends differently than people expect, I said. She studied my face for a second as if she was trying to decide whether that was a warning or just another mysterious comment from a customer who enjoyed sounding dramatic. Before she could respond, the front door of the lounge opened again and a cool draft of night air slipped inside. A couple walked in laughing, followed by a man in a dark jacket who paused just inside the entrance to scan the room. He did not stay long. He left less than 10 seconds later. Most people would not have noticed him at all, but I did. Marco noticed him too. From across the room, our eyes met for a brief moment. He gave a small nod that confirmed what I already suspected. Victor Hale had already started asking questions. Lily tapped the counter gently to bring my attention back. Earth to mysterious customer, she said lightly. Your drink is getting warm. I lifted the glass and finished the last sip before placing it back on the counter. Then I reached into my pocket and set a few bills beside it. Keep the change, I said. She glanced at the money and raised an eyebrow slightly. That is generous for one drink. I pushed the stool back and stood up. Not generosity, I said quietly. Just preparation. She frowned slightly at that. Answer. Preparation for what? She asked. I looked toward the door where the man had stood moments earlier, then back at her. For when someone decides to test a sentence I should not have said out loud. I stepped away from the bar, but I did not leave the lounge immediately. Nights like this require patience. The door had opened, a stranger had looked around, and Marco had already confirmed what that meant. Victor Hale was moving pieces. Slowly, quietly, exactly the way he always did. I stopped near the edge of the room where the light from the bar softened into shadow and looked back once more. Lily Harper had already returned to work like nothing had happened. She collected empty glasses from 2 stools down, stacked them carefully, and carried them to the sink. The sound of running water blended with the low music above us. She lived inside the normal rhythm of the night. Orders, payments, polite smiles. She had no idea that somewhere outside this building, someone had just started asking about her. Marco approached a moment later. He kept his voice low, the way men do when they are used to speaking around important details. The man who came in was not a customer, he said. I know, I replied. He was looking for something specific. Marco glanced toward the bar where Lily now handed a receipt to a couple preparing to leave. Or someone specific, he said. I did not answer immediately. My attention remained on the same quiet figure behind the counter. You ever notice how the most important moments begin when someone ordinary walks into the wrong room? I said finally. Marco crossed his arms slightly. Happens more than people think, he replied. The problem is they usually realize it too late. I exhaled slowly and adjusted the cuff of my jacket. Victor would not rush this. That was the part most people misunderstood about him. He did not create chaos. He created pressure. The kind that builds slowly until someone makes a mistake. Across the room, Lily wiped the bar again and glanced briefly toward the door, probably wondering why the man who stepped inside earlier had left so quickly. To her, it was just another strange moment in a long shift. To me, it was the beginning of a pattern. Marco followed my gaze. You planning to tell her? He asked. Tell her what? That two of the most stubborn men in the city are suddenly interested in the same bartender. I let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. No, not yet. Marco studied my face for a second. Then he nodded once, understanding the decision without needing further explanation. The fewer people who knew the shape of the board, the harder it was to manipulate it. At the bar, Lily finished cleaning the last of the glasses from a small group that had just left. She stretched her shoulders slightly, like someone easing the tension of a long shift, and checked the clock on the wall. Nearly closing time. The crowd had thinned enough that conversations no longer overlapped across the room. She began stacking a few unused stools at the far end of the counter, preparing for the quiet part of the night. It would have been easy to walk out and forget the entire situation. The sentence earlier could have stayed exactly what it was. A strange comment between rivals. But Victor Hale had already heard it. And Victor never ignored curiosity. Lily returned to the center of the bar and noticed that my glass was empty. She looked toward the spot where I had been sitting earlier and seemed slightly surprised to see me standing across the room instead. For a moment she considered whether to ask if I wanted another drink. Then she simply gave a small wave of acknowledgement and returned to arranging the bottles behind the counter. She still believed this night would end the same way every other shift did. A quiet closing. A short drive home. Sleep. Tomorrow would be another normal day. I looked toward the front door again. The street outside was calm, the glow of streetlights reflecting on the pavement. But the city had already begun shifting around one careless sentence. Marco spoke again after a few seconds. So what is the plan? I watched Lily place the last clean glass upside down on the shelf and finally answered. For now, nothing changes. Marco raised an eyebrow slightly. That's simple. For now, I repeated. Because if Victor Hale was curious enough to send someone here tonight, the next move would not take long. And when that happened, Lily Harper would finally discover something the rest of the city already understood. Some sentences cannot be taken back once the wrong man hears them. Closing time has a sound if you listen carefully. Chairs scrape softly against the floor. Conversations fade into shorter sentences. The music lowers half a step like the room itself is preparing to breathe again. I stood near the back of the lounge watching the night wind down piece by piece. Lily Harper moved behind the bar with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this routine many times before. She stacked the final glasses, counted the register, and wiped the counter until the wood shined under the warm lights. To her, this was the end of a long shift. To me, it felt like the moment right before the next move in a game that had already started. Marco checked his watch beside me. Almost midnight, he said. I nodded slightly but did not take my eyes off the bar. A couple near the door finished their drinks and headed out into the cool air of the street. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The room felt larger now, quieter. Lily walked to the far end of the counter and flipped a small switch that dimmed the lights over half the seating area. She glanced toward me briefly, as if remembering I was still there, and gave a polite smile. Most customers had already left. Only my table remained occupied. She picked up a towel and began polishing the last clean glass on the shelf. The simple motion repeated slowly in the reflection of the mirror behind her. That was when the door opened again. The sound was soft but sharp enough in the quiet room that everyone noticed. Lily looked up first. Marco turned his head next. I did not move. Victor Hale stepped inside like he had never left earlier that evening. His coat was draped neatly over his shoulders, and the same calm smile rested on his face. The kind of smile that suggested patience rather than urgency. Lily straightened slightly behind the bar, surprised to see a customer arrive so close to closing. "Sorry, we are almost closed," she said politely. Victor lifted one hand in an easy gesture. "I will not take long," he replied. His voice carried across the quiet room with comfortable confidence. He walked toward the counter and rested his hands lightly on the polished surface like he belonged. "There." Lily hesitated for a moment, then reached for a glass anyway. One last drink before closing rarely hurt business. "What can I get you?" she asked. Victor glanced around the lounge slowly before answering, his eyes passing briefly over my table without stopping. "Surprise me," he said. "Something memorable." Lily began preparing the drink with careful movements, while Victor studied the shelves behind her. After a moment, he spoke again in a conversational tone. "Busy night." She nodded while measuring the liquor. "Pretty normal, actually. People come in, people leave." Victor smiled slightly at that. "Yes, they do." He leaned a little closer to the counter, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel more personal. "Tell me something, Miss Harper. Do you always work alone this late?" Lily shrugged while finishing the drink. "Usually the manager stays in the office," she said. "But tonight it is just me closing up front." Victor accepted the glass she handed him and lifted it to examine the color under the lights. He took a slow sip, then nodded in approval. "Excellent choice." For a moment the room fell silent again. Then Victor turned his head and looked directly toward my table for the first time since entering. His smile widened slightly, like a man greeting an old acquaintance. "I had a feeling you might still be here, Dominic," he said. Marco shifted in his chair, but I raised one hand slightly and stood up. The distance between Victor and me was only about 20 feet across the polished floor. Lily glanced between us, confusion beginning to show in her expression as she realized the two men in the room clearly knew each other. Victor rested his elbow on the counter casually and spoke without looking away from me. "Funny thing about curiosity," he said calmly. "Sometimes it brings people back to the same place twice in one night." I walked toward the bar slowly, the quiet sound of my footsteps echoing through the nearly empty lounge. Lily stepped back slightly to give space as I reached the counter. Victor lifted his glass in a small gesture between us. "I believe earlier you said something interesting," he continued. I stopped beside the bar and looked at him evenly. "People say many things at night," I replied. Victor smiled again and took another sip before answering. "Yes," he said softly, "but not all of them are forgotten so easily." Victor Hale understood silence better than most men. He did not rush the moment after speaking. He simply stood there at the bar, one elbow resting casually against the polished wood, his glass turning slowly between his fingers. The ice inside it shifted with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet lounge. Lily stood a step back behind the counter, looking from him to me and then back again. She was beginning to understand that the conversation unfolding in front of her had nothing to do with drinks anymore. I stopped beside the bar and placed my hand lightly on the edge of the counter. Victor watched me with the relaxed curiosity of a man who had just confirmed a theory. "You remember what you said earlier?" he continued calmly. I glanced briefly at the glass in his hand before answering. "I remember many things," I said. Victor smiled slightly. "I am sure you do. But some sentences carry more weight than others." Lily looked between us again, clearly trying to follow the exchange without interrupting. She wiped the same small circle on the counter with her towel, even though it was already clean. Finally she spoke. "Am I missing something here?" Victor turned toward her with an easy expression, like a polite customer explaining a misunderstanding. "Not at all, Miss Harper," he said. "Just two old acquaintances discussing a comment from earlier tonight." Lily crossed her arms lightly, not defensive but curious. "What kind of comment?" she asked. Victor raised his glass slightly in my direction as if presenting evidence. "Dominic here made a very confident statement about you." The room felt even quieter after that sentence. Lily blinked once, clearly surprised. "About me?" Victor nodded slowly. "Yes. Something about ownership, if I remember correctly." Her eyes shifted toward me. I could see the moment the memory returned. The brief silence from earlier in the evening. The strange sentence she had overheard without fully understanding it. She straightened slightly behind the bar. "I thought that was some kind of joke," she said. Victor chuckled softly. "Perhaps it was. That is why I came back. I wanted to see whether Dominic meant it as a joke. His gaze returned to me, sharp beneath the calm tone, or whether he simply spoke before thinking. I met his eyes without changing expression. Curiosity can be expensive in this city. Victor, I said quietly. He shrugged one shoulder. Only when it is ignored. Lily placed the towel down on the counter and leaned forward slightly. Okay, hold on, she said. I clearly walked into the middle of something I do not understand. She looked directly at me now. Earlier you said something like that because of him. She nodded toward Victor. I gave a small nod in return. Yes. She frowned slightly. And now he is back because he thinks that means something. Victor lifted his glass again. Exactly. Lily exhaled slowly and glanced toward the clock on the wall before looking back at us. You both realize I am just trying to close the bar, right? Victor laughed quietly at that. That is exactly what makes the situation interesting, he replied. Lily studied his face for a moment as if deciding whether he was serious. Then she turned to me again. So which one is it? She asked calmly. Was that sentence earlier just something said in the moment? Or does it actually mean something to you? The question hung between us like a line drawn across the room. Marco shifted slightly behind me at the table, but I did not look back. Victor watched my face carefully, the same patient smile still resting on his lips. Lily waited with her arms resting lightly on the counter, her expression calm but focused. For the first time that night, the entire situation came down to a single answer. I looked at the nearly empty lounge around us. The dim lights. The quiet shelves of glass behind the bar. The woman standing in front of me who had walked into this night, expecting nothing unusual. Then I looked back at Victor Hale and finally spoke. That depends, I said slowly, on whether you came back tonight hoping I would take those words back. Victor tilted his head slightly, intrigued. And did I? I let the silence stretch for one more second before answering. No, I said. You came back to see if I would say them again. Victor did not answer immediately. He stood there with the same calm expression, the glass still in his hand, studying my face as if he was deciding whether the night had just become more interesting or more complicated. Lily remained behind the counter, with both hands resting lightly on the polished wood, waiting for someone to finally explain why her ordinary closing shift had turned into a conversation between two men who clearly knew far more about each other than they were saying. The clock on the wall ticked quietly toward midnight. Outside the large front window, the streetlights reflected off the empty pavement like the city itself was listening. Victor finally let out a slow breath and smiled in that careful way he had when he respected a move on the board. You always did enjoy making situations complicated, Dominic, he said calmly. I shrugged slightly. Only when someone insists on testing them. Lily looked from one of us to the other again. So let me understand this, she said slowly. Earlier tonight you said something strange because of him. Now he came back because he wants to know if you meant it. She paused and narrowed her eyes slightly. And both of you are acting like that sentence matters more than it should. Victor chuckled softly. That is because sometimes a simple sentence carries a message. Lily looked directly at me again. Well, does it? The question hung in the air like the last note of a song. I watched her for a moment before answering. She did not look intimidated anymore. Just curious. Maybe a little annoyed that her quiet evening had been interrupted by something she did not ask for. Finally I spoke. I said what I said earlier because someone was speaking about you like you were part of the furniture in this room, I explained calmly. Lily blinked once at that. Victor tilted his head slightly, but did not interrupt. I continued. And sometimes the easiest way to stop a conversation is to make it clear that it is already finished. Victor lifted his glass again with a thoughtful expression. Interesting explanation, he said. But it still leaves one question. He glanced toward Lily and then back to me. Do you actually believe those words? The room fell silent again. Lily watched my face carefully now, clearly waiting for the answer just as much as Victor was. For a moment I said nothing. Then I looked around the nearly empty lounge. The dim lights above the bar. The quiet shelves of bottles. The door that would close in a few minutes, ending another normal night for everyone. Except the three people standing in this conversation. I returned my attention to Victor. You came back tonight because you thought I might take it back, I said. Victor smiled slightly. Or repeat it. Lily crossed her arms lightly again. And are you going to? She asked. I met her eyes directly this time. No hesitation. No second guessing. The same calm tone I had used earlier that night returned to my voice. Yes. Victor laughed quietly, clearly satisfied with the outcome of the experiment. Lily stared at me for a second like she was trying to decide whether I was serious or just stubborn. Then she shook her head slightly and let out a small breath. "You two realize I am still standing right here," she said. Victor raised his glass toward me in a final gesture. "That is exactly the point," he replied. He finished the last sip of his drink and placed the empty glass on the counter. "Well, Dominic," he said calmly while adjusting his coat. "Now I know the sentence was not an accident." He turned toward the door and paused before leaving. "Just remember something," he added without looking back. "When a man says words like that in my presence, the city eventually wants to see whether he intends to prove them." The door opened and closed quietly behind him, leaving the lounge silent again. Lily looked at me across the bar with an expression somewhere between disbelief and curiosity. "You know," she said slowly, "I was expecting tonight to end with washing a few glasses and going home." I almost smiled as I picked up my coat. "Some nights do not end the way people expect," I said. She studied my face for a second longer. Then she asked the one question that told me the night had only just started. "So what exactly did I just get pulled into?"